That's the ending? What the fuck?
We need to talk about endings in horror. I'm talking about books, movies, games, any kind of horror story. I'm reminded of the words of Mort Rainey in the movie Secret Window, who said, "You know, the only thing that matters is the ending. It's the most important part of the story, the ending. And this one is very good. This one's perfect." And I've got to be honest with you, the ending of Secret Window actually is pretty good. Don't worry, I'm not going to spoil it for you. But the problem is, there are a lot of horror stories out there, whether in print or on the screen, that completely blow it in the final act. I'm not talking about the ones that are terrible all the way through. Those are their own special little slice of hell. No, I'm talking about the ones where we're really enjoying the book or the movie. They're creepy and the characters are interesting and everything's going great, and then they just fall apart at the end. No genre is immune to this sort of thing, but I think it's particularly common in horror. And I want to take some time to talk about why horror endings often fail, and then I'll provide some examples of some great endings, some terrible endings, and even a couple that left me with some mixed thoughts. Since we're talking about endings, there's always a concern about spoilers, so let me put your mind at ease right here at the start. The first part of this video is going to be purely abstract discussion, no spoilers at all. A bit later on, I will openly discuss the endings of a few books and films, but I'll be sure to give you ample warning and divide the video into chapters so you can skip around as much as you need to. In case you haven't seen some of the films I'll be discussing, but you want to do so, I'll be leaving links down in the What's It, like I always do, so you can check them out for yourself. Before we get to those examples though, let's talk about horror endings in general. I suppose it's hard to end any story. The writer needs to wrap everything up in a believable way while also hopefully keeping things exciting. Aristotle said the ending of a story should seem simultaneously surprising and inevitable. If you've ever written anything, you know just how hard that can be to pull off. If the ending comes completely out of nowhere, it's not going to be satisfying because nothing in the story's build-up leads the reader or the viewer to that conclusion. On the other hand, if the ending is completely predictable, that's also not satisfying because why should we bother to finish a story if we already know exactly how it's going to turn out? I mean, sometimes the journey is more important than the destination, but hopefully we're building to something that will blow our minds, right? In order to meet Aristotle's goal, an ending needs to be unpredictable in foresight, but completely explainable in hindsight. Aristotelian narrative structure is largely driven by cause and effect. Just as in life, we don't always know in advance what the effects of our actions will be, but we can see after the fact how our various decisions lead to their various outcomes. That's all true of any genre. The horror genre in particular has some extra challenges, though, that I think makes horror particularly vulnerable to the terrible ending. When I was first thinking about making this video, I did a bit of Googling around just to see what other people were saying on the subject, and one of the ideas I happened across is that endings in horror are often real downers. The author Brian Keene even titled one of his collections of short stories, Unhappy Endings. And it's true. Horror, by its very nature, because it deals with horrible things, probably delivers unhappy endings more often than any other genre. And a lot of people don't find that particularly palatable. Even horror audiences can sometimes feel the sting of too many depressing endings. In this book, How to Write Horror Fiction, William F. Nolan cautioned us, "In horror, you can get away with negative, unhappy endings in short stories much easier than you can in novels. This is because, in a much longer narrative, the readers have sweated out the adventure and trials with your protagonist, and they wish to share the final victory. They feel cheated otherwise. They have more invested in a novel, and it's a letdown to them if things turn out badly." It is indubitably the case that the reader or viewer who is highly emotionally invested in a story's characters would prefer things to work out for the better. And in fact, I've argued before that the horror genre, despite its subject matter, is actually an optimistic genre indeed. There's a lot of power in the idea that no matter what demons we may face, we're capable of triumphing over them. and I think the horror genre is the perfect place to explore that idea. Neil Gaiman said something along those lines. You'll have to pardon me for paraphrasing because I can't seem to relocate the exact quotation, but when asked why he wrote scary stories for children, he said something to the effect that the world is full of terrifying monsters and it's important for children to learn both that there are monsters in the world and that they have the power to defeat them. The psychologist Jordan Peterson wrote something similar in his book Beyond Order. For all intents and purposes, there is an image that exists inside of us of the terrible hunter that lurks in the night. That is why children become afraid of the dark once they are old enough to move around by themselves. There's a monster in the dark, Dad, they insist at nighttime, and Dad assures his son or daughter that there is no such thing as a monster. Well, the adult is wrong and the child is exactly right. There might not be a monster in that particular section of the dark right now, but that is of small comfort when you are 3 feet high and tasty, and there could be, will be, a monster there in the future. That is why it might be of more use to let your child know directly and through your own actions that there is always something sinister and dangerous in the dark, and that it is the job of the well-prepared individual to confront it and take the treasure it archetypally guards. It is something that an adult and child can act out with great results. And the psychological literature is beginning to bear out quite similar ideas. Colton Scrivener, a PhD candidate and psychological researcher at the University of Chicago, has been studying some of these ideas and has found that horror helps build resilience against a variety of traumas and stressors life might throw at us. He even recently found that horror fans fared better on average than non-fans when it came to psychological resilience during the recent pandemic. So there's something to be said for the idea of a happy ending, or at least a triumphant ending, even in a horror story. And I can understand why a lot of people don't like sad endings. They don't like to see the villains win. But that's not really what I'm talking about here. The fact of the matter is, sometimes the bad guys do win. Life isn't always just. I think all the finest literature, both horror and otherwise, teaches us that this is no excuse for nihilism. And horror in particular teaches us what happens when we do fall prey to nihilistic thoughts. But if horror is meant to scare us, sometimes it has to actually deliver the most horrific of endings. The kinds of bad endings I'm talking about, though, are the ones that just aren't satisfying. Perhaps they break Aristotle's rule. Perhaps they're too cliched. Perhaps they undermine everything that happened before. Even when we put aside the problem of unhappy endings, I still think horror might get more than its share of terrible endings. Why is that? I think it has to do with the dual purposes that a horror ending must fulfill. It has to both wrap up the story and deliver a good scare. Unfortunately, these things are sometimes at odds with one another. The fact of the matter is, we're more afraid of things when they're nebulous and unknown. It's not so much that humans are afraid of the dark as that we're afraid of what might be lurking therein, because our night vision is terrible and there could be anything out there. The same goes for why cosmic horror is often effective. When the evil is not only beyond our present understanding, but beyond even our ability to comprehend, we're likely to be much more frightened of it. There's a belief in many religious and spiritual traditions that knowing the name of some entity gives one power over it. In the Western Judeo-Christian tradition, this idea is intimately connected with the Logos. In Genesis, God creates the universe by speaking it into existence. He names the things and then they come into being. Similarly, when mankind is given dominion over the animals, this is signified in part by the power to name them. Perhaps more relevant to the horror genre, the same is true in most versions of demonology. It's generally understood that to know a demon's name is to have power over it. If we know the demon's name, we can banish it back to hell, so demons are thought to be extraordinarily protective of their true names. And the same is true not only in the Judeo-Christian traditions, but in a variety of religious and philosophical traditions from around the world. In Taoist thought, a talisman inscribed with an entity's true name can grant the holder control over that entity. Likewise, most folk magic traditions ascribe some power to naming things. Even the stereotypical magic word, abracadabra, though bastardized and rendered cliché by cheesy magicians, is thought, however less than definitively, to be derived from either the Hebrew or the Aramaic for "I create as I speak." Its first known origin was from a 2nd century medical text by Cyrenus Sammonicus, who described the healing properties of an amulet inscribed with the word rendered in the shape of a triangle. This kind of thinking is also true psychologically. In fact, whatever one's views on religious matters, I think it's fairly uncontroversial to say that religious traditions ascribe power to naming because of the psychological factors. Whether you choose to believe that that's because a deity revealed that knowledge to us, or whether you think it's just that religions developed around ideas that our ancestors found psychologically beneficial, the fact of the matter is, the ancient religious texts are remarkably psychologically sophisticated on this matter. Whether you believe in demons literally or only metaphorically, knowing their names is a good way to make them go away. If we take them metaphorically, as in the kind of mental demons we might deal with in our lives, then psychologists will tell you that the best and perhaps only way to banish them and resolve the psychological problem is to first identify what the problem actually is. In clinical psychology, one of the most effective therapies for affective disorders like anxiety or depression is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. Though I don't have the time to go into great detail on the matter, the gist of the practice involves training the patient to recognize, that is to name, their maladaptive thoughts and behaviors, and then take steps to correct them. Getting back to horror, I think the same thing is true in fictional horror. When we read or watch a story involving some unknown evil, it has a high probability of frightening us, or at least making for a good, tense story. But once we know what the big bad actually is, much of that fear and tension dissipates. Once we can name our adversary, ghost, skeleton, vampire, demon, whatever it may be, we can begin to formulate a plan to deal with it. But if we don't even know what's happening, everything is so far beyond our control that it's a much more frightening situation. And that's where the trouble begins when it comes to ending a horror story. Because the ending needs to maintain the tension, but it also needs to conclude the story. Perhaps it's unfortunate, but we tend to expect revelations and resolutions at the end of a story. Very rarely does a book or film come along that can leave things amorphous and ambiguous and still satisfy an audience. But these are competing imperatives. On the one hand, to wrap up the story, and on the other hand, to maintain the tension. And I think that's where a lot of horror endings ultimately go wrong. By the time the story reaches its climax, the characters uncover whatever dark secret lies at the heart of the story, the monster is revealed, and everything comes to a conclusion. Even if it's an unhappy ending, it brings everything into the light and undercuts that fear of the unknown that may have driven much of the story up to that point. That's not to say that every horror story necessarily involves the fear of the unknown. Consider a zombie movie. Almost anyone will do. We know exactly what the monster is right from the start. Those stories, if they're going to frighten us at all, are going to use different techniques. So I'm not saying that all horror movies suffer from these conflicting imperatives of maintaining mystery and wrapping up the story, but I am saying that a lot of them do, and that drives a lot of weak endings in our favorite genre. And of course, this doesn't explain every bad ending in horror. Some of them are just poorly written and undercut everything that came before. But I suspect that's true of any genre. So now we've reached the point at which I'm going to start providing some examples, which of course means we're headed into potential spoiler territory. Before I do that, let me just remind you to be sure to like this video, subscribe and ring the notification bell, share my videos far and wide, and of course leave a comment. But since we're talking endings in this video, let me just ask you to keep your comments either completely spoiler-free or well-labeled so that we don't ruin anything for anyone else. And so I don't ruin anything for you, like I said before, I'm dividing this video into chapters. So if you haven't seen one of the films or read one of the books that I'm about to discuss, you can just go down to the description and click over to the discussions for ones that you already know. I've selected a grand total of 8 books and films that I think provide excellent examples of both good and bad endings. So let's get right to them. Let's start off on a high note with what I consider one of the finest endings I've seen in a very long time, and that ending belongs to the 2008 film Martyrs. Of course, I'm talking about the original French language film here, not the American remake, just so that we're all on the same page. This is a strange kind of film. It's often rated as one of the more extreme and graphically violent films out there, which is true enough, but its plot takes some interesting turns. As you're watching, you're constantly on uneven footing because the plot starts off as a kind of revenge film, and then it twists into something completely different, and then twists again into something not quite like anything I've ever seen before. It's almost like 3 separate films, each with their own tone and themes. But the thing about it is, all 3 acts are built specifically to lead us to a real exclamation point of an ending. In the final act, we learn that all of the violence that's been done has been in the pursuit of creating martyrs, people who suffer so profoundly that they transcend human experience and glimpse the next world. This is a project organized by an interesting cast of characters headed by a woman known only as Mademoiselle. At the very end, our main character Anna, after being beaten, humiliated, and ultimately flayed alive, achieves that state of transcendence, and she whispers something into Mademoiselle's ear. When Mademoiselle's assistant asks if Anna's message was clear, she says that it was. He then asks what's actually in the next life. Mademoiselle simply says, "Keep doubting," and promptly shoots herself in the head. I really hope you've taken my spoiler warnings to heart, because that's the kind of ending that really needs to be experienced. My little description does not do it justice. It's the sort of film that leaves you just sitting in your chair, staring blankly at the screen, even after the credits roll. Of course, there are all kinds of theories about what Anna might have whispered to Mademoiselle in that crucial moment to produce such a dramatic response. I have ideas of my own, and I could make a whole video just discussing those possibilities. But that's why I think this is such an effective ending. It certainly wraps up the story in the sense that it brings to a close the current drama between Anna and Mademoiselle and her strange society, but it doesn't answer all of our questions. It satisfactorily ends the narrative without spoon-feeding us all of the answers. In fact, it raises even more questions. Just what did Anna whisper to Mademoiselle that was so terrifying? By resolving the narrative in a way that raises even deeper and more horrifying questions, Martyrs managed to resolve the conflict between imperatives that we've been discussing by finding a novel way to satisfy both of the imperatives. It takes a lot of talent to pull that off, and I wish a lot more people would study the ending of Martyrs to see how it can be done well. Unfortunately, the film is so extreme that it has a fairly limited audience. I'm not saying it shouldn't be extreme. It needs to be. But I do wish more people would see the depth behind the gore and give its ending some real thought. On the other end of the spectrum, we have a film that attempted one final scare at the end, and it fell completely flat. The kind of exclamation point ending delivered by Martyrs is a rare thing to be able to pull off, so it's perhaps not a big surprise that when Sinister attempted a low-grade version of the same, it didn't quite work out. And it's a real shame, because Sinister was a pretty good movie throughout. No, I didn't find it quite as scary as it has a reputation for being, but I'm pretty desensitized to the genre, so that's not necessarily the film's fault. The structure of Sinister is fairly standard for horror movies. Weird and scary stuff starts to happen, and the main character gradually figures out what's really going on. In this case, all of the horror is the work of Bughuul, an obscure pagan deity who was not from real lore but invented specifically for the movie. As the story progresses, we do feel a bit of the sting of those conflicting imperatives that we've been talking about. I mean, once we know who or what Bughuul is, we can name it, a fair amount of the tension ends up being lost. However, the film does a pretty good job of managing this problem by identifying the villain, yet keeping him and his abilities confined somewhat to the shadows. And it actually comes to a pretty good ending. Maybe not an award-worthy ending, but good enough to satisfy an audience. After the horrible things have happened, we're treated to a close-up shot of a box of old video reels that had been at the heart of the story. The camera slowly draws back as we hear some eerie sounds, suggestive of more horrifying things to come for whoever might be unfortunate enough to happen across those videos next. That's a pretty good ending. And then the film completely blows it. Instead of maintaining that tension and letting the audience carry it home with them, the film interjects, in just the last second or so, a completely pointless jump scare as Bagul's face leaps onto the screen, accompanied by a loud noise. Now, I'm not completely against jump scares. They have their place, and a few of them are actually excellent. But this is the most ham-fisted and misplaced jump scare I've ever seen. It takes what could have been a decent run-of-the-mill ending and turns it into an ending that I'm highlighting here as one of the worst. How did this happen? Well, it happened because Hollywood is stupid. You didn't need me to tell you that, but I actually do have some insight into what happened with Sinister. I heard one of the filmmakers speak at a panel discussion at Denver Comic Con several years back, and he told us what happened. The film originally had the good ending, the one that I described, but they showed it to a test audience and people were too frightened by it, so the studio injected the jump scare specifically to break the tension. That's what jump scares are actually for. They don't build fear or tension, they break the fear and tension and give the audience an opportunity to let all of their heebie-jeebies go all at once. It's a useful tool for any horror creator to keep in his tool belt, but in the case of Sinister, it was used so poorly simply because some idiot with decision-making power at the film studio forgot that horror movies are supposed to be scary. Let that be a lesson to all of you out there. Test audiences and studio executives may have their place in the creative process, but take whatever they say with a grain of salt because, as likely as not, it'll be the dumbest thing you could possibly do. The same problem we've been talking about happened in the case of Hereditary. A lot of people love that movie, so I might get some hate for saying so, but I simply can't stand the ending. I will say, though, that it was a really excellent film right up until that ending. It was creepy as hell, and one scene in particular caught me completely off guard. Y'all know the one I'm talking about. I was not expecting that, and I still think it's one of the best single moments in a horror film from recent years. But then we get to the ending, and it's the same old story. All the mystery gets sucked away when we realize everything has just been the work of a demon trying to take possession of one of the characters' bodies. That's not a terrible premise for a horror movie, and to the film's credit, there are little hints just out of sight throughout the entire movie, so it doesn't come completely out of nowhere. But it's the same problem once again. Once we know who the villain is, everything that happened before just seems to make too much sense. The mystery is gone, and with it, the tension. Plus, when the cultists show up, let's just say that's the wrong kind of scary. I realize nudity is connected with Satanism, but I could have happily gone several lifetimes without seeing that. Pontypool is a recent favorite of mine, and it's one of those films that hasn't gotten nearly the audience it deserves. You just don't hear that many people talking about it, which is a shame because it's a damn near perfect horror movie. The thing that makes it so great is that it never overplays its hand. It's driven entirely by the strength of a couple of performances, as the whole thing is set with a fairly small cast inside a radio studio, as the main character is a sort of shock jock and he's reacting to strange news that begins to come in from outside. We're slow to realize what's happening, though it's clear from the start that something horrible is going on. And yes, we do get some revelations toward the end, but they're paced and handled in such a way that each revelation, rather than undercutting the horror by relieving the mystery, simply makes things seem all the more terrifying and all the more mysterious. Each revelation unlocks entirely new questions, and we can watch the film with confidence that no matter how much we learn, we're never going to figure out all of the answers. In fact, the premise at the heart of Pontypool is so original, and as far as I know, actually unique, that the revelation is interesting in its own right rather than just being there to wrap up the story. A full discussion of the implications of Pontypool's ending would require a video of its own, and maybe one of these days I'll make it. But for now, we can just be pleased with a grade A ending. Next up is a book rather than a movie, and it's one I have some mixed thoughts about when it comes to the ending. When Brian Keene's The Rising first came out in 2003, and dear God, that's almost 2 decades ago, so now I feel like a dinosaur. When The Rising first came out, the ending caused a bit of discussion, and I'll be the first to admit I didn't care for the ending at first. The premise of The Rising is that the main character, Jim, is traveling across the zombie-infested country to try to find and rescue his son. Along the way, he meets an interesting cast of characters, and it's an excellent book all the way through. When it comes to the ending, Jim and company have just reached the house where Jim's son has been living. Jim runs inside while the others wait outside. A moment later, they hear 2 gunshots, and then we're treated to these closing lines. They ran toward the house to see what had become of their friend. Above them, the newly risen moon shined down upon the world, staring at a mirror image of its cold, dead self. And that's it. The resolution is not made absolutely clear. A lot of people were angry and confused. And I'll be honest, when I first read it, I was in that camp. But as I've matured, though, the ending has grown on me quite a bit. Though it all takes place off-screen, so to speak, I think the ending is actually rather clear. Jim found his son, who had become a zombie by the time he arrived. So he shot both of them. The end. It's bleak yet satisfying, like so much of Keene's work tends to be. But since it wasn't abundantly clear, the fans demanded a sequel, and Brian ended up discarding that implied ending and letting the characters continue their journey in a follow-up book called City of the Dead. And that's why I have mixed thoughts about this ending. I think it's a great ending as it is. It doesn't spoon-feed us everything, but if you pick up on the implications, it does bring the story to a conclusion. And I think that's a great approach. However, with that ending, we never would have gotten City of the Dead, which is an excellent sequel in its own right, so we ultimately have to consider The Rising's ending to be a bit of an annoying cliffhanger, though it certainly does make the reader want to go out and buy a copy of the sequel. All that being said, don't let the fact that I consider the ending to be a bit of a mixed bag dissuade you from reading the book if you haven't already and have chosen to ignore my spoiler warnings. The Rising is an excellent read, and I would certainly recommend it, no matter what you might think about the way it ends. While we're on the subject of books, our next topic of conversation is this book, Devil House by John Darnielle. This is a new book this year, and it was actually on my list of most anticipated horror for 2022, which video you should also watch if you happen to have missed it. Unfortunately, the book ended up actually being a bit of a disappointment, and a big part of the reason why was the ending. Let me be clear about one thing, though. John Darnielle can write. Some of the prose in this book is exquisite, and some of the scenes are magnificent. The premise is even fairly interesting. The problems do begin early on in the book, though, because it involves non-linear storytelling that just never quite comes together and ends up being more of a muddle than a coherent story. But the worst problem, though, is the ending. This one doesn't actually suffer from the same kinds of issues we've been discussing, but it instead commits the cardinal sin of horror writing. If you ever take a course in writing horror, or any fiction for that matter, one of the first things your instructor should tell you is that "it was all just a dream" is not a satisfactory ending. By all means, feel free to write a twist ending, but if the twist actually undoes everything the rest of the story has already accomplished, then it's simply a terrible ending. Well, in Devil House, It's not all a dream exactly, but the effect is the same. Let me explain. Most of the book is written in the first person. The final pages not only introduce a new character with whom we're not yet acquainted, which is itself a bit of a cheat, but actually negates everything the main character has established previously. The final chapters amount to nothing but a confession that the main character had been lying about everything established in the first-person narrative throughout the entire book. If you're a writer or a filmmaker, don't ever do that. I'm not going to say this was my favorite book up to that point by any means, but it might have earned something like a 3-star rating if I was feeling in a sort of generous mood. But an ending like this one immediately relegates it right into 1-star territory. I mention it here not only as an example of a bad ending, but to raise the point that in addition to the conflicting imperatives issue we've been discussing, sometimes writers just deliver a plain old dud of an ending. If we were to try to explain it within our framework, though, I'd say that in this case, not only does the revelation break the tension, but it completely breaks the story. And then there's The Mist. This is a good novella by Stephen King, which you can find in the short story collection Skeleton Crew. However, I'm not talking about King's novella here. I'm instead talking about the 2007 film adaptation by Frank Darabont, which even Stephen King himself admits has a better ending than his original story. The setup is the same in both versions. A strange mist blankets a small town, trapping the residents. But there are also monsters in the mist. It's a great story, very classical Stephen King kind of stuff. But the film's ending is what really sets it apart. In the movie, the main characters escape from the store where they'd been sheltering, but their car runs out of gas in the mist. So the leading character, figuring it beats the alternative, shoots the rest of the survivors to spare them the suffering at the hands of the monsters. He intends to do the same to himself, but has run out of bullets. So he steps out of the car, calling for the monsters to come and get him, just in time to see the mist recede and the army's rescue forces roll into town. Yeah, it's bleak as hell, as many of the best horror endings are. But it sidesteps the issue of whether revealing too much of the monsters takes away from the fear. We already know about the monsters, though their precise nature is never quite explained. But The Mist managed to capitalize on the fear of our own reaction to the monsters, both throughout the film, but especially in the ending. And it meets Aristotle's criteria because it certainly brings the story to a strong conclusion, but I don't think anyone saw it coming. King's novella took a different approach. The beginning of the ending is roughly the same as the party sets off driving through the mist. But King chose to just end the story there, leaving the outcome ambiguous. I actually think that's a decent ending as well, because I'm not one of those who insists on everything being packaged up in a nice bow at the end of a story. I'm cool with a bit of ambiguity, and I actually think ambiguity can often be more frightening than specificity. But what works on page doesn't necessarily work on screen, and I do think the film needed more of a definitive ending. And with Frank Darabont at the helm, what an ending we got. One of the classic endings of the genre, I think. And that brings us to our final case study, a film called The Devil Inside, which is widely regarded as having one of the worst endings in the entire horror genre. Though, as I'll explain, I actually think it's a bit more of a mixed bag, and it doesn't bother me as much as it did a lot of other people. As of right now, on Rotten Tomatoes, The Devil Inside boasts a miserable 5% on the tomato meter and a not much better 22% audience score. It doesn't fare much better on Metacritic with an average score of only 18%. The question is, does it deserve such low numbers? What's going on here? Well, the film itself is not going to knock anyone's socks off. It's a fairly run-of-the-mill, maybe slightly better than run-of-the-mill demonic possession story. It's not The Exorcist by any stretch of the imagination, but neither does it deserve such dismal reviews. It's the ending in particular that has everyone's panties in a bunch, and that's what we need to talk about, because in a way there are two elements to the ending. The first is the ending of the film proper. At a climactic moment, the characters pile into a car, racing off to see an exorcist. Suddenly, and apparently under demonic influence, they swerve into traffic and crash the car. That's the end. Much like happened in one of the other stories we've been talking about, and I'm not going to specify which one in case of spoilers, their fate is never confirmed in any sort of detail, but it is at least heavily implied. I suppose a lot of people might not like that ending. It's certainly more ambiguous than people are expecting. But I actually think it's a perfectly serviceable, if not excellent, ending for a movie. It doesn't overplay its hand by explaining too much, but does seem to bring the character's story to a rather definitive, if somewhat abrupt, conclusion. The problem is the film then does overplay its hand with a title card immediately following this scene and preceding the credits. The title card said, "The facts surrounding the Rossi case remain unresolved. For more information about the ongoing investigation, visit www.therossifiles.com." Okay, that's a bit weird. This isn't a documentary, so directing the viewers to a website to learn the rest of the story is a bit of a bold move. Presumably they were trying to lean in on the marketing strategy of claiming damn near every horror movie under the sun is really based on a true story. That's a bit annoying at the best of times because the so-called true stories usually have essentially nothing to do with the horror movies. But in this case, it's doubly insulting because there never even was a Rossi case. It's an entirely fictional film. The website didn't actually offer all that much. Its main page had a fake newspaper article about the case, complete with a photograph of one of the actresses, and there were a couple videos and links to external sites about religion and exorcism and so forth, but nothing like what was really promised in that title card. Essentially, it was just the movie's marketing webpage. Worse, the site wasn't maintained. If you try to go to that URL now, you'll get to some placeholder site because Paramount Pictures only kept it alive for a short time. So now, anyone who watches the movie years later doesn't even get the website unless they use something like the Internet Wayback Machine. The director defended the ending, but acknowledged that the website was a late addition and might have been what set people off. And I think that's exactly right. The film's actual ending isn't terrible, but linking to the website makes it feel like the ending wasn't meant to be the ending, but that there's supposed to be more to the story. When nothing else can actually be found, either because the website is gone or just because there was never anything useful there in the first place, the whole thing ends up feeling like a bit of a cheat. But if you ignore that one title card with the website, I think the film's actual ending does an okay job of fulfilling those conflicting imperatives we've been talking about. So ultimately, though I seem to be the only one who doesn't absolutely hate the ending, I actually think it's a bit of a mixed bag. And there we have it. Some of the best and worst of horror endings, along with a couple of mixed bags. Be sure to come back next time for more spooky awesomeness. Until then, take care and stay scared.